All right. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure for me to be here at Blackfriars. I did teach for 9 years at the Dominican House of Studies, the Pontifical Faculty for the Eastern Province Dominicans in the United States. So I feel very much at home to be lecturing in a Dominican studium. There is a handout for the talk. And there will be just a few quotations to which I'll call your attention as I go through the paper. It is a principle within the metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas that, in effect, cannot be more perfect or of a greater actuality than its efficient cause, that, in effect, cannot exceed its cause, that, in effect, cannot be more powerful than its cause. As it's often called, the principle of proportionate causality is also frequently expressed in the form that nothing gives what it does not have, or as a character in a story by Ralph McInerney once put it, nemo dat quod non got. Such a principle is, understandably, the foundation for concern about the irreconcilability of a theory of biological evolution with Aristotelian or Thomistic philosophy. So this paper is going to presuppose, some, you could say, sympathy with that tradition, that you would be worried enough about the desire to reconcile Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics with a theory of biological evolution. And it is very much a historically oriented paper. I'll be focusing on the metaphysics and the biology of Thomas and Aristotle, but in a way that's hopefully preparatory for thinking about the issues raised by biological evolution. So the issue is this: both Aristotle and Thomas do in fact hold that there are some animal species whose members can only be generated through reproduction by already existing members of the same species. If this is so, then the emergence of such animals through any natural evolutionary process will be impossible. That horses beget horses and human beings beget human beings might seem to be the most obvious application of the principle that nothing gives what it does not have, that the actuality in an effect must be preceded by the same actuality in the cause. And these are, in fact, the sorts of examples given by Aristotle in Book 9 of his Metaphysics, in his discussion of the temporal priority of actuality in the universe. But as Aristotle's discussions of the generation of living substances, both in Book 7 of the Metaphysics and in his biological works, indicate, however, matters are somewhat more complicated, given Aristotle's commitment to the paired claim that some living things are spontaneously generated, like flies from rotting flesh or oysters from slimy mud. It cannot be that in Aristotle or Thomas's mind that the requirement for a generator of the same species, in cases like the horse or the human being, is simply a consequence of a general principle that something cannot give what it does not have, or that in effect cannot exceed its proximate cause. For otherwise, spontaneous generation would be ruled out. Matters are similarly complicated by Aristotle's discussion of another topic in the same text, namely animals that arise from hybridization, such as the mule, the offspring of a horse and a donkey. There's little hope of properly understanding Aristotle's assertion of the temporal priority of actuality, or Thomas's principle that in effect cannot exceed its cause, without a careful examination of these cases and of the biological and cosmological views that concretely instantiate these metaphysical principles. In what follows, I'm going to talk a bit more about the notion of proportionate causality, followed by an examination of what the proportionate causes are for Aristotle and for St. Thomas of living things, both the spontaneously generated and those that arise through reproduction. This will allow us ultimately, and this is the ultimate point, to clarify why Thomas in particular holds that some animals can only arise through reproductive univocal generation. And I'm going to show that St. Thomas does not reach that conclusion merely by applying an abstract metaphysical principle about causality. It is instead due to particular claims in his Aristotelian biology and physics. I will then, at the end, offer some brief suggestions about implications for the debate about the reconcilability of Aristotelian or Thomistic metaphysics with biological evolution. So first, section 1, concerning proportionate causality. Like the claim that there is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the sense, the formulation that nothing gives what it does not have only explicitly appears in Thomas's writings in Objections, as a principle invoked by an interlocutor looking to cause some trouble. And just as the formulation, there is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the sense, is in fact difficult to reconcile, as Therese Corey has recently shown, with many of the details of Thomas's understanding of human intellectual self-knowledge. In a similar way, when Thomas's recent interpreters who speak of the principle of proportionate causality offer an interpretation of what this principle in fact means in practice in Thomas's thought, they have to say that the principle amounts to the claim that something's efficient cause must possess the form or perfection or actuality that it causes, either by having that perfection itself formally, that is, by having the same form in the same way, or by having it in some more imminent way, or just by having it virtually, where to have the form or perfection virtually, in virtute, in virtus, is just to have it in such a way that it is able to cause it in something else. Such a principle, so understood, will still have some important implications concerning something identified as an absolute first cause. A first cause would still have to possess all perfections, at least virtually. This in turn would be a reason for saying that an absolute first cause is superior in some way to its effects, if it is also supposed with Thomas that virtual possession of some actuality is a more perfect mode of possessing that actuality. But apart from that further claim, the principle that nothing gives what it does not have, in its application to a given efficient cause, would seem to amount only to the claim that an efficient cause must at least be able to cause whatever perfection it causes, even if its ability to cause that perfection is not due to its own formal possession of that same perfection. And so it turns out to be a principle that does not tell us very much directly on its own. So this raises the question, why have I titled my presentation The Proportionate Causes of Species in Aristotle and Aquinas? Well, even if this principle does not tell us much on its own, it is nevertheless always a question concerning any given effect. What are the causes to which this effect is proportionate? What are the things able to cause this effect and why? Now, Thomas himself does use the language of proportion between effects and causes, and as it happens, when he speaks of a necessary proportion between effects and causes, I found in text that he says two closely related things. First, that per se effects are proportioned to per se causes, while incidental or per accidens effects are proportioned to incidental or per accidens causes. And second, that particular effects are proportioned to particular causes, while universal effects are proportioned to universal causes. And we will, in fact, need to comment on each of these distinctions later in our discussion of Aristotle and Thomas's views about animal generation. All right, before I turn to any of the details of Aristotle and Thomas's respective understandings of the proportionate causes of the species of living things, I want to first motivate the claim that consideration of such topics as spontaneous generation and hybridization will be directly relevant to thinking about the reconcilability of biological evolution with Aristotelian or Thomistic metaphysics. In articulating his interpretation of the first book of Genesis in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas considers the question of whether the work of creation is truly complete as of the seventh day. The third objection in this article notes that many things of new species appear even today through spontaneous generation. And as I will explain in a little bit, this is Aristotle's view, that spontaneous generation is in fact constantly producing new kinds of living things. So here's what we find in St. Thomas's reply to this objection. And this is text number 1 on the handout. Quote, "Nothing entirely new was afterwards made by God," that is, after the seventh day. "Rather, all things in some way preceded as already made in the works of the 6 days. Also, new species, if these appear, pre-existed in certain active powers, just as animals generated from putrefaction are produced by the powers of the stars." So that's a reference to spontaneous generation. As the powers for these animals are possessed by the stars and the elements, which powers they received at the beginning, if new species of such animals should also be produced. And then Thomas also brings up the case of the mule, saying, quote, "Certain animals of a new species sometimes also arise from the connection of animals of diverse species, as when from a donkey and a horse there is generated a mule, and this species too previously existed causally in the works of the 6 days." Now the question has been raised about this text, whether the mule is in fact a distinct species of animal in Thomas's mind. About this, Thomas asserts plainly in another text from his De Potentia that the mule is of a species distinct from both the horse and the donkey. It is a species that is, as it were, in the middle between the species of the horse and the donkey. So St. Thomas's position in the text that I just quoted is clear. There can be new species of living things that emerge after the work of the 6 days, so long as they can be said to be present in the active powers of things already created. That is, there must exist created things capable of causing their generation. Now, most students of Aristotle will be familiar with what he has to say about the mule in Book 7 of his Metaphysics, where he indicates that although the mule is neither a horse nor a donkey, so it does not share the same species as its parents, it is nevertheless of the same genus as its parents, a genus to which Aristotle gives the name a beast of burden. Some interpreters have filled in the gap in a way that would deny that the mule is a genuine species, by suggesting that the mule is just an imperfect member of its genus, not a member of a genuine species. But this is not what Aristotle says, and it's rather impossible to square with what Aristotle thinks about the relationship between individuals, species, and genera. But numerous interpreters have also assumed that Aristotle thinks that the mule is sterile simply because it is generated through hybridization, and that its sterility is a consequence and sign of its imperfection, its failure to be of a genuine species. Aristotle discusses the mule at some length in On the Generation of Animals, Book 2. We do in fact find in Chapter 8 an argument along the lines just suggested. In attempting to explain the sterility of mules, Aristotle suggests as what he calls an abstract and general proof of their sterility, that perhaps it is due simply to the fact that the mule arises from the copulation of two animals different in species. But immediately after offering this general proof, however, Aristotle proceeds to say that, quote, "This account is too general and empty, since theories not based on the appropriate principles are empty, appearing to be connected with the facts, without really being so. The basis of this particular account is not true, for many animals produced from different species are fertile, as was said before." So Aristotle has, in fact, at this point in his work on the generation of animals, listed numerous fertile hybrids of which he is aware, and he has claimed that, as far as he knows, the mule is peculiar because it alone is sterile among hybrid animals. Now, we can multiply other examples of hybrids that are sterile now, but Aristotle knew just of the mule. So why is this particular species sterile on Aristotle's view? he proceeds to suggest that it has something to do with the limited reproductive fecundity of the horse and the donkey. Each of these species typically gives birth to singletons. It often takes repeated mating for conception to occur. The donkey is of a colder nature than most quadrupeds, and the mare produces less menstrual blood than most female animals. Now, that a colder nature would make for lower fertility is because, as I'll get into the details of this shortly, Aristotle thinks that semen causes the generation of a new animal through vital heat, and he thinks that menstrual blood supplied by the female is only the matter from which the new animal is formed. Putting all of these factors together, Aristotle tells us that when a crossbreeding contrary to nature occurs, and there is, quote, added to this the difficulty that they have in producing a single one when united with their own species, the result of this crossbreeding will need nothing further to make it sterile. So Aristotle's fascination with the mule is not because it is not of a genuine species. It is rather that there should exist any genuine species that is nevertheless by its nature sterile. But the explanation for its sterility is to be found, he thinks, not in an abstract principle about species, but rather in the specific natures of the horse and the donkey from which the mule is descended. Okay, with that now we can turn to Aristotle and Thomas's views about reproductive generation and spontaneous generation. So this is section 3. The Aristotelian theory of animal generation, and even more so, Thomas's reception and understanding of that theory, cannot be properly understood apart from the Aristotelian cosmology and elemental theory. So on the handout, I've given you the little representation of the old cosmology with the Earth at the center, the celestial spheres around it. Everything in the middle around the Earth is made of the 4 elements of earth, air, fire, and water. The spheres rotating around the Earth are made of some 5th element. The things made of the 4 elements are subject to generation and corruption. The spheres rotating around, Aristotle thinks, are eternal and move eternally. Okay. The dependence of all substantial generation and corruption in the sublunary, everything below the sphere of the moon, the dependence of substantial generation and corruption upon the rotation of the heavenly spheres is grounded for Aristotle in the claim that the primary active quality in all sublunary substances is heat, which is caused in the sublunary by the sun as its heavenly sphere rotates around the Earth. So on the Aristotelian theory of the generation of living things, it is through heat that matter is qualitatively disposed to the generation of a new living substance, just as it is also through heat that an individual animal digests and assimilates food into itself through the hot blood that it concocts from its food. In the case of reproduction among animals, the sperm that comes from the father, Aristotle thinks, is itself concocted, purified blood. The close relationship between blood and semen in Aristotle's theory of reproduction is important to note. Blood is that through which the animal ultimately assimilates nutrient into itself, growing and healing by generating its own homogeneous parts, such as flesh and bone, in an organized fashion. Semen is thoroughly concocted blood, endowed with a power similar to blood, namely a power to produce such things as flesh in an organized way, but ordered to doing so in the conception of a new individual from the matter provided by the female. As Thomas puts it, borrowing Avicenna's phrasing, the sperm has a formative virtue, a formative power derived from the soul of the parent. Now, because the blood of an animal is ordered towards producing the flesh, the bones, etc. of this individual animal with its individual characteristics, the semen of the same animal is ordered in principle towards producing a perfect individual likeness of the father, although this is never, in fact, perfectly achieved. It's important that Aristotle's account does attempt to explain the likeness of the offspring to its parents in its individual characteristics, rather than only in its specific likeness. Individual likeness to the father is the end aimed at by the active agent cause, the sperm. Just as the species never exists independently of some individual, so too the agent that reproduces in the same species does so by aiming to produce a similar individual. Aristotle compares semen to the tool of a carpenter, endowed with the movements given by the carpenter. So you should imagine a carpenter working with a tool on wood. But he thinks of the semen as if it's a tool that could be endowed by a carpenter with a tendency to move in the way that's necessary to form something, even when it's been separated from the hands of the carpenter. So it's as if a carpenter could give his tool the power to go make a table, right? Okay. That's how he thinks of the relationship between the semen and the animal that generates. Whereas, however, a saw's movements are locomotions, changes of place, again, semen acts through heating in a structured way. And just as the saw does not become part of the table, so too Aristotle thinks of semen as an extrinsic agent that acts upon passive matter, such as menstrual blood supplied by the female. So he thinks of semen as extrinsic agent that does not enter into the composition of the thing that it generates. Just as many of the individual characteristics of a table would be due to the characteristics of the wood upon which the carpenter acts or upon which the saw acts, perhaps some of those characteristics might be even contrary to what the carpenter was trying to achieve, so too many individual characteristics of the generated animal are due to and are a likeness of the mother, due to her providing the proximate matter from which the animal is generated. All right, after these details about Aristotelian biology, I feel we should take a brief time out, right? We should note, of course, that our understanding of sexual reproduction is, suffice it to say, quite different. Okay? The process of sexual reproduction, as we understand it, is such that neither parent aims at a perfect copy of itself in all of its individual characteristics, as the process is ordered per se towards some combination of traits of the parents or of the parents' own ancestors. So on Aristotle's view, that the offspring of sexual reproduction should be anything but the spitting image of the father is always praeter naturam, apart from what nature intends, apart from what the act of sexual reproduction intends. Okay? Just in the difference in our understanding of sexual reproduction and what it's ordered towards, there's already more room for descent with modification, right, than there is in the Aristotelian account. Okay, all right, back to Aristotelian biology. It is because all heat in the sublunary depends upon the activity of the sun that all reproductive generation also depends ultimately upon the sun. As Aristotle observes in Physics, Book 2, Chapter 2, and this is an observation tremendously important for Thomas, quote, "Man and the sun generate a man." Thomas cites this observation frequently, and he takes it to mean that the sun and the individual animal are related to one another as first a universal principal agent, the sun, and second, a particular instrumental agent, the animal that is reproducing, and the semen that it produces. So just as a carpenter might use a tool, an instrument, to produce some effect by a motion that the carpenter imparts to the instrument, so Thomas thinks that all generative activity by individual animals depends upon the heating action of the sun. The sun, as it were, uses the individual male animal as an instrument through which it produces new instances of the same species. I mentioned above that in asserting the need for a proportion between causes and effects, one thing that Thomas insists upon is that universal causes and universal effects are proportioned, and particular causes and particular effects are proportioned. So consider the following from chapter 10 of Thomas's treatise on the separate substances. This is text number 2 on the handout. Quote, "A twofold cause is found of some nature or form, one which is per se and absolutely the cause of such a nature or form, but another which is the cause of this nature or form in this individual. Indeed, the necessity of this distinction is clear if one considers the causes of things that are generated. For when a horse is generated, the generating horse is the cause that the nature of a horse begins to exist in this individual. But the generating horse is not the per se cause of the nature of horses. For in order for something to be the per se cause of some specific nature, it is necessary that it be its cause in all things having that species. Since, therefore, the generating horse has the same specific nature, it would need to be its own cause, which cannot be the case. It remains, therefore, that there must be, superior to all those things participating the nature of horse, a universal cause of the entire species. Such a cause the Platonists held to be a species separate from matter, in the manner that the principle of all artificial things is a form in the art, that is, in an artist's knowledge, not existing in matter. But according to the opinion of Aristotle, it is necessary to place this universal cause in some heavenly body. Whence, distinguishing these two causes, Aristotle said that man and the sun generate man. So Thomas clearly has in mind here the discussion of the generation of living substances in Metaphysics, Book 7, in which Aristotle rejects the theory of Platonic forms as causes of generation. In commenting on this part of Metaphysics 7, Thomas says that Aristotle intends to show, against Plato, that the natures and forms existing in individual sensible things need not be, and even could not be, generated by forms existing outside of matter, but rather that they are always generated, quote, by forms which exist in matter. So this is the anti-Platonic orientation of Metaphysics, Book 7. Thomas takes it that Aristotle's point is to show that whatever the active power responsible for generation is, it always has to be a form already in matter. But Aristotle does not, on Thomas's view, do away with a single universal cause of generation, a universal per se cause of generated natures. But on Thomas's view, Aristotle places this cause within the material universe, in a particular heavenly body, the sun. As Thomas elsewhere puts it, quote, "Whatever causes generation in lower bodies moves its patient to a species, that is, to a specific nature, as the instrument of a heavenly body." So, it is not in fact Thomas's view that the individual generating animal is on its own a sufficient agent cause of the generation of a new animal, as it depends upon its being moved by a higher agency in order to cause a thing's nature. So coming back to the principle of proportionate causality as it's sometimes applied in these discussions, on Thomas's view, the individual animal does not have its own nature on its own in such a manner that it is able to give that nature to something else. It has that nature in such a manner that it can be used instrumentally by a superior cause. However, it is again vital to Thomas's construal of Aristotelian metaphysics against Platonic metaphysics that one needs to place the active causes for the generation of natural substances within the material universe. And I'll return to that point in a little bit at the end of my talk. But because the vital heat through which sperm generates a new animal is itself ultimately from the sun, Aristotle and Thomas think that the phenomenon of spontaneous generation, which they take to be empirically evident, mistakenly, they think that this phenomenon can be readily explained by the activity of heat present in non-living matter, acting upon certain sorts of matter that happen to have become disposed in such a way that something living can be generated from them, again, such as rotting flesh or slimy mud. For Aristotle and for Thomas, there is some indeterminacy about what results from spontaneous generation, as what results depends upon how the matter happens to have been disposed, rather than upon the sort of structured heating provided by sperm, which aims at educing a specific form with certain individual traits. This is to say that animals arising by spontaneous generation arise by chance, by incidental or per accidens causation. What we mean by this is that the proximate cause is not acting for the sake of producing the specific effect. Aristotle, in fact, thinks that entirely new kinds of spontaneously generated animals may arise constantly. But he also holds that no spontaneously generated animal successfully reproduces in kind. Okay? There's lots of new spontaneously generated kinds all the time. None of them successfully reproduce in turn. That's Aristotle's view. Now, on this point, we encounter a rather wide range of views in the later peripatetic tradition. Thomas takes up this point in his commentary on the Metaphysics. He's aware of the range of opinion among interpreters of Aristotle on this point. Thomas asserts as his own view, it seems he's putting it forward as an empirically observed fact, that there are species of plants that can be spontaneously generated and then go on to produce seed, reproducing in kind. But as Thomas reports, his own position is a rather tame one in comparison to the position of Avicenna, who asserts that any living species that can reproduce in kind, up to and including human beings, can also be produced under the right material conditions by spontaneous generation. Now, Thomas does draw the line at what he calls perfect animals. So here we come to the claim. For Thomas, following Aristotle, there are some living species that are only reproduced from the same kind, from individual members of the same kind. Thomas does draw the line. He thinks that plants and what he calls imperfect animals may arise by spontaneous generation, but the generation of perfect animals requires the instrumental contribution made by the animal reproducing within its species. Where Thomas indicates why this is so, and so where he indicates what exactly he means by perfect animals as compared to imperfect animals, he consistently indicates that it has to do with the organic complexity of higher animals endowed with multiple sense organs, including those of the inner senses. And he tells us that, quote, perfect animals have a supreme diversity in their organic parts, but plants a minimal diversity. And he tells us that, quote, the power of a heavenly body suffices for generating certain less perfect animals from properly disposed matter, for it is obvious that the more things that are required for the production of a more for it is obvious that more things are required for the production of a more perfect thing. So it's not that Thomas thinks that it is beyond the power of heat from the sun to draw forth the form of an animal with a power for sensation and locomotion, like the flies that he thinks are generated from rotting flesh. Okay. Still less does he think there's any impediment to the spontaneous generation of vegetative life, of living things from non-living matter. Okay. So again, it's not that there's no reason why animals can't be spontaneously produced. It's just that sufficiently complicated animals in terms of their organs, he thinks, go beyond what can be accomplished just by ambient heat in the air. Okay. The structured heating accomplished by sperm is, he thinks, necessary in order to account for the formation of the more complex bodies of higher animals. Just as the tools of a carpenter, in a way, augment what the carpenter can accomplish through his own hands, so on Thomas's view, the heavenly body, in fact, needs the contribution made by the reproducing animal in order to produce another member of its species. Now, as we just noted, chance, incidental causation, is involved in the production of the spontaneously generated. The activity of the proximate cause is not for the sake of producing the specific result. So Thomas explains this. This is text number 3 on the back of the handout. He tells us, quote, "Nothing prohibits some generation from being per se when referred to one cause, which is nevertheless per accidens and by chance when referred to another cause, as is clear in the very example given by the philosopher." So the example in the text is that you could have a body part that would be assisted by being given a massage or being rubbed, and someone could happen to do that without intending to help that body part heal, right? So in one way it would be incidental that that part of the body was healed, and in another way it wouldn't be. Okay, all right. So that's the example he's referring to. Okay. So when he says, quote, "For when health follows from a rubbing outside the intention of the one doing the rubbing, the health that results, if it be referred to the nature that regulates the body, is not per accidens, but is intended per se. But if the health that results be referred to the mind of the one doing the rubbing, it will be per accidens and by chance. Similarly, too, the generation of an animal generated by putrefaction, if it be referred to particular causes, the inferior agents, will be found to be per accidens and by chance. For the heat that causes decay does not intend by a natural appetite the generation of this or that animal that arises from putrefaction in the way that the power which is from the semen does intend production in a certain species. But if the generation from putrefaction be referred to the heavenly power, which is the universal regulative power of generations and corruptions in these lower bodies, then it is not per accidens, but is intended, since it is of the intention of the heavenly body that there be adduced into actuality all the forms which exist in the potency of matter. So the proportionate causes of spontaneously generated organisms include, for Thomas, both the incidental, the per accidens proximate cause, and a per se remote universal cause. In the case of generation through reproduction, by contrast, the proximate cause acts as a per se cause, whose causal activity is ordered towards a specific result, albeit still as a particular instrument of a universal principal agency. All right. Numerous interpreters of Aristotle have rightly pointed to the theory of spontaneous generation by chance, as relevant for thinking through the compatibility of biological evolution with Aristotelian principles. James Lennox, in particular, has suggested that Aristotle would be delighted by the discovery that organisms that have arisen by chance through natural processes whose proximate causes did not of themselves aim at what specifically resulted, that such organisms nevertheless do go on to reproduce in kind, acting as per se causes whose activity is properly for the sake of what results. As I have noted above, although Aristotle places restrictions on which living things can arise by chance from the activity of ambient vital heat, and although Thomas does the same, Thomas sees no difficulty in general about spontaneously produced organisms going on to reproduce in turn. As we've also seen in Thomas and Aristotle's discussion of the mule, there is no prohibition against two animals reproducing in such a way that what results from them is something different in kind from either of its parents. All right, just two concluding remarks. First, all of the preceding has been offered in the hope of giving some flesh and bones to the somewhat abstract metaphysical claims that the potential is preceded temporally by the actual, and that whatever is in the effect must be first virtually in the cause, as these claims were understood by Aristotle and Thomas. To understand these metaphysical principles as Aristotle and Thomas think about them requires that one think through the causal claims involved in their physics and biology. No principle in Aristotle or Thomas about the perfect not arising from the imperfect precludes the generation of new kinds of living things by chance. Furthermore, the reason why Thomas follows Aristotle in holding that some living things can only be generated by sexual reproduction has to do with his understanding of the limits of what ambient vital heat can accomplish in comparison to the structured heating provided by sperm. That is, the requirement for univocal generators for higher animals is for Thomas a physical, biological requirement. It's not just a matter of applying an abstract metaphysical principle. If there were some disposed matter which could be acted upon in the necessary way by some physical agent other than sperm concocted from the blood of a male horse, then there would be no metaphysical prohibition or any biological or physical prohibition against a horse arising by chance. And I'll just note that it seems fairly clear that we have the grounds for offering an explanation of how that might be the case on the basis of a very different understanding of the physics and the biology involved in reproduction. Second, however, turning back to Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, I also think it has to be emphasized that it's no accident that the matters of spontaneous generation and of the generation of the mule through hybridization are topics discussed by Aristotle in Metaphysics Book 7 and by St. Thomas's commentary on that work, in their argumentation against the need for Platonic separate forms as principles of generation. Aristotle and Thomas's purpose is to show that causes which they identify in the natural world, the reproducing animals, even if they are of different species, the sun and the heat that it causes, that these physical causes are adequate for explaining the generation of all living things. In an Aristotelian cosmos, the active powers for the generation of living kinds are the powers of physical agents. In many recent discussions of how to possibly reconcile Thomistic metaphysics with biological evolution, however, contemporary authors have had the tendency to make direct recourse to the causality of the divine agent, who would be able at the appropriate times to infuse the form of a new species into the first member of a new kind whenever the matter apt for that form had arisen by chance. Now, perhaps this is the metaphysical conclusion at which one needs to arrive. I'm not offering an argument directly against it. But if we have to arrive at that metaphysical conclusion, we will have left Aristotelian or Thomistic metaphysics behind on one of its central conclusions about natural substances. It is ironic, even if understandable, that many contemporary Thomists have been led to this from a version of the principle of proportionate causality, which is itself derived from the very discussion in which Aristotle and Thomas have argued against Plato. But I would close by suggesting instead that perhaps we should be optimistic with St. Thomas that it pertains to the goodness of the divine to endow creation with the powers to act as the genuine causes of anything moved or brought to being by generation. Thank you.